Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. As you know, I'm Jenny Johnson, a graduate student at LSUS, and I just finished completing a study called The Effects of Text Complexity on Oral Reading Fluency. So prior to conducting the study, I did some research, and I'm going to highlight some of the studies that I read to guide me in my planning. Forbes did a study on trying to see if the reading speed affected students' accuracy, and they found that students did read more quickly, but that their accuracy decreased. Dini and Shim also did a study on oral reading fluency assessments, and they found that struggling readers were more anxious during the test, and that the teachers didn't love the assessments either, but that they still used the results for grouping their students. They also found that most teachers defined fluency as some combination of the main four components, which are accuracy, speed, prosody, and comprehension, with comprehension being the most important. Bolaños and colleagues did a study on the automated assessment of measuring oral reading fluency, which was a computerized program, and they found that it holds promise for the future with providing something that can more quickly measure students' oral reading fluency. Reed and Kershaw-Herrera did a study on cohesion and readability and how they influence reading comprehension, and they found that cohesion and readability separately affect text complexity, and that was important to my study because I knew that I would need to measure text for both of those features. In Begany and Green's study, they measured the readability formulas, trying to find which one was the most valid, and they found that the Dale-Child formula was the most reliable and valid, and the Lexile formula was also good for 3rd and 4th grade students. That's the formula I selected since I'd be working with that age level. McComas and Noltemeyer and their colleagues did a study as well on the different methods used for teaching oral reading fluency, and they found that phrase drill with error correction, listening passage preview, repeated readings, and other contingencies like tracking the print with your finger and trying to read more were all good methods for improving oral reading fluency instruction. And they found that no one method was really more effective than the other, but that they all worked well, and you really just needed to find the ones that worked best for your students. So why should this study be conducted? Well, there's a gap in research regarding the matching of text with students' oral reading fluency ability. And so there's this big push to differentiate instruction and meet the needs of all of our learners. So maybe we need to start rethinking how we are teaching instruction in oral reading fluency. Is using the same level of passage for all students effective? Or would differentiating the level of passages used aid those students who are below level while also challenging students that are above level? So the purpose of this study was to fill the gap in research by answering this question: which method would lead to increased achievement among students and a more precise indicator of oral reading fluency ability? The use of text of varying complexity matched to students' ability, or the use of the same level of text for all students, a one-size-fits-all approach. So my hypothesis was that a differentiated approach would be the most effective method, for improving oral reading fluency, and that it would provide a more precise measurement of students' ability. I thought particularly below-level students would show the most improvement in the experimental group. On-level students would show about the same level of improvement, and higher-level students, I thought their scores would decrease slightly, only because they'd be reading texts that were more complex. But I thought the overall difference between the groups would probably be minimal. So I conducted a quasi-experimental study comparing the differences in students' oral reading fluency scores when students were receiving instruction with text of varying complexity, which was my experimental group, and text of the same level of complexity, which was my control group. I sent home consent forms, randomly selected 2 classes for the experimental group and 2 classes for the control group, and then I pre-assessed those students using the Comprehensive Reading Inventory by Flint Cooter. I then used those results to designate the students as above level, on level, or below level, and those results, obviously, the students were unaware of which level they were in. I then measured the passages based on readability and cohesion for the passages that I would be using for both groups. I provided daily fluency instruction for 6 consecutive weeks, with 1 week off due to a hurricane and the Labor Day holiday. But anyways, I used the same instructional practices: repeated readings, listening passage preview, error correction, core reading, and partner reads. And then at the end of each week, I assessed each student using the comprehensive oral reading fluency scale. I did that in real time, and then I later listened to a recording of their reading and scored them again to get a second score. This was the comprehensive oral reading fluency scale used. It was designed by Benjamin and her colleagues, and it is a 16-point scale that measures automaticity and expression, including intonation and pausing. Afterwards, I analyzed all of the data, comparing the means, standard deviation, variance, and range, and then trying to determine if there was a statistically significant difference between the means of both groups and then between the means of the subgroups. I also did correlational analysis as well. So here are the results of my study. The control group sample size comprised 28 students with 3 below level, 5 on level, and 20 above level students. The experimental group sample size was similar, with 34 students, with 7 of those being below level, 5 on level, and 20 above level. So there was a significant disproportionate number of students, with the above level students, being more. I had 6 oral reading fluency scores for each participant, and I found that there was a strong inter-rater correlation between my real-time rating and my recorded rating. The difference in means between the experimental group and the control group was considered statistically significant, with the control group scores being higher than the experimental group. The results by subgroup showed statistically significant differences between the below-level groups and the above-level groups of the experimental group and the control group, but there were insignificant differences between the on-level groups. And those subgroups, as you can see on this next slide, the subgroups of the control group had had higher means than the experimental group. So that was not what I expected. Okay, so here are some of the findings that were aligned with my hypotheses. The below-level students in the control group, their scores were located to the left of the mean, likely because they were reading texts that were above their abilities. And the control group's above-level students, their scores were located to the right of the mean because they were reading texts that were below their abilities. And the on-level students' scores were similar for both groups. And this is just a graphic to portray how the subgroups' scores were in relation to the mean. So here are a few more findings that were aligned with my hypotheses. The mean course score of the above-level students in the experimental group was lower than the mean course score of the above-level students in the experimental group, which is what I had thought, because those students in the experimental group would be reading texts that were more challenging, and actually up to 300 lexils higher than those in the control group. I also found strong correlations between the experimental group's text levels and their starting instructional levels, which was their actual ability, showing that there was a close matching of text with their ability. And there were also strong correlations between the starting instructional levels and the oral reading fluency scores of the experimental group and the control group, but this shows that the experimental group's matching was stronger. So here were some findings contrary to what I had thought, and that is that there was a greater improvement in oral reading fluency scores of the control group than the experimental group. There was also a greater improvement among the below-level students in the control group than the below-level students in the experimental group. But notably, the average reading level in the experimental group was only 2.45, and the control groups was 3. So my goal was to fill a gap in research regarding the matching of text to students' abilities and the potential greater improvement in their oral reading fluency scores and to figure out if a one-size-fits-all approach really met the needs of all learners. So I used previous research helping me determine that I needed to measure cohesion in addition to readability, helping me figure out which formula to use, which in this case was the Lexile formula, and guiding me in the instructional practices that I would use when teaching fluency instruction, or when teaching fluency. So through all of this, I did gain a greater awareness of the students' reading levels in the experimental group, more so than in the control group, because I can more accurately say that a student was reading on a first grade level, not just below level, but which actual level they were reading at. Differentiating the text appeared to have benefited the above level students, because those students still had a fairly high average at 94.58%, and they were reading texts, as I told you, that were up to 300 lexiles higher. So unfortunately though, I had hypothesized that the below level students would show the greatest improvement in the experimental group, and that was not the case. I do think if there were more time and a little bit more flexibility with grouping, that could have been different and the results might have been more meaningful. So differentiation is difficult and it is time consuming. Some limitations of my study were that there were a disproportionate number of students in each of the subgroups. There were 65% or more above level students in both the control group and the experimental group. So in the future, if the study were to be repeated, it would be prudent to pilot test the students to make sure that the subgroup sample sizes are about the same. And to extend the study to make it last 9 to 12 weeks rather than 6 weeks. So some implications for the study are that we need to reevaluate the process for selecting texts that are used for oral reading fluency. Should we select the text before, after? Well, I felt that we really need to select the text after we assess their ability. So even if that means, maybe before you would choose the text at the end of the year so that you could have the copies made, but we really need to know where our students are before we select those texts. And we need to observe the impact of text complexity on all of our students. How are our students doing? Are they frustrated and are they challenged? And you may want to decide whether to differentiate based on how your students do on those pre-assessment results. So here are some ideas for future research, and I'll just talk about a few of them, but are schools doing their students a disservice when they assign, say, third grade level text to a class of students that are reading primarily on the fourth grade or higher level? And in Benjamin's scale, the comprehensive oral reading fluency scale that I showed you, could it be improved upon by using half points since some students fell above, at the top or at the bottom of the range? And then finally, what I think holds the most promise, and this goes back to Bolaños' study, is the idea of using an adaptive computer program that a student could read the passages and be advanced or even brought down a level based on how they perform. And it could generate reports showing the data of how students are doing and rating their accuracy, their speed, and their prosody, and maybe even have features where the students can read to the computer and it corrects their errors, or where they can hear a model of fluent reading read. So this concludes my study. Thank you so much for coming and for allowing me to be a part of your school. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Were there any outliers that pushed your data one way or the other?
Yes. And there were 2 students in my below level group and the experimental group that were at risk. They were reading on a kindergarten to first grade level, and they were third graders. And their scores really did weigh down them, and I considered pulling them out, and I did consider them outliers, but I feel like every classroom has these sort of at-risk students in their classrooms, and that information was still significant, and so I decided not to exclude it. Okay, so thank you for coming and allowing me to be here with you today. I hope you learned a lot from my study. Thanks.